Aloha and welcome to this presentation on Iwi Kupuna, or Ancestral Remains. My name is Kavika Cruz. Before I begin, I wanted to share a little bit about my background. I spent 5 years working at Cultural Service Hawaii, which is an archaeology firm located out in Waimanalo. My job there was to write cultural impact assessments, or CIAs. And the CIA is a component of an environmental impact statement, or EIS. The rules that govern EISs is called Hawaii Revised Statutes, or HRS 343, Environmental Review Law. And the rules that guide cultural impact assessments is called Act 50, which came out in 2001. I was also the lead researcher for the 30-meter telescope and the Hawaii Super Ferry. So here are the steps or the process of CIAs. The first thing I have to do is I have to get a definitive project description from the developer. This cannot change once the project starts. Next, I have to do community outreach by location, and what that means is if it's in Kailua, I'm going to outreach the Kailua community. Then I'm going to do background research of the ahupua'a that the project is located in, and I'm going to try to determine if Iwi Kupuna will be discovered. Then I'm going to try to determine all the potential impacts to culture, not just Hawaiian culture, but any culture. At the end, I am going to make my recommendations on ways for them to avoid or mitigate these potential impacts. The way I can determine if we are going to discover Iwi Kupuna for a proposed project is to study previous EISs and CIAs conducted in the same area. I could also review burial records at the State Historic Preservation Division, or SHPD. I can also consult with Hui Malama i Nā Kupuna o Hawaiʻi. They're a Hawaiian organization that handles Iwi Kupuna. I could consult with the Oahu Island Burial Council, or the OIBC. I can research at the Hawaii State Archives at the Bishop Museum to see what records they have. And I could also meet with recognized cultural and/or lineal descendants. In Hawaiian culture, caring for Iwi Kupuna is very important. Native Hawaiian culture suggests that Iwi Kupuna has spiritual power, or mana. Proper caring for Iwi Kupuna is essential for maintaining our spiritual health and is the responsibility of family descendants. Ideally, ancestral burial sites should be left in place and undisturbed. If these burial sites are disturbed, we defer to the wishes of identified lineal and cultural descendants and the ohana, the family, to see what they want to do with these burial sites. The kuleana, or responsibility, is usually given to family or loved ones to care for the Iwi Kupuna. It's a high honor and high responsibility to do that caring. Iwi Kupuna must be protected from enemies, if there are any. The location of Iwi Kupuna must be kept in secrecy, usually hidden in inaccessible areas such as caves or sinkholes. This practice usually held for li'i and mo'i, the king and queen or the chiefs, but commonly used for family members as well. Who are lineal and cultural descendants of Iwi Kupuna? A lineal descendant means, with respect to Native Hawaiian skeletal remains, a claimant who has established, to the satisfaction of the council, direct or collateral genealogical connections to certain Native Hawaiian skeletal remains. What this means is a lineal descendant has the proper records to prove that discovered Iwi Kupuna may be their family members through death certificates or to land commission awards or to other documentation to support that. Cultural descendants are very similar to lineal descendants. The only difference is they can establish genealogical connections to an area. not a specific parcel, but an area like a district or an ahupua'a. Previously identified burial sites means when we get a new project and we find out that 10 years ago on the same project footprint, they had already discovered Iwi Kupuna. So when we do this new project, there is a high probability that we may discover more Iwi Kupuna. Inadvertent discoveries of Iwi Kupuna are when we have no idea that we were going to find Iwi Kupuna. But during our archaeological survey, or some trenching or some digging, we ended up coming across some Iwi Kupuna. Prior to Captain Cook's arrival in 1778, deceased Native Hawaiians were buried in what is known as the fetal position, and they're usually buried in sand. So when you come across a site like this, you know this is a burial site that is prior to Western contact in 1778. Modern burial practices shifted after Western contact to coffins. So this is a telltale sign that this particular burial site is ancient Hawaiian prior to 1778. On this slide, here are three of the biggest Iwi Kupuna burial sites in Hawaii. One of them is at the Ritz-Carlton on Maui. The other one is at the Kaneohe Marine Base. And the last one is at the Kawaiahao Church. This next slide illustrates all the different epidemics that came to Hawaii after Cook's arrival. And these epidemics contributed to the large amount of burial sites in Kaka'ako. The reason Kaka'ako was at the forefront of all these burial sites is because that's where the hospital was. So everyone that got sick with all these different epidemics and plagues and stuff migrated to Kaka'ako to seek medical help. And a lot of them ended up dying, and a lot of them were buried right there in Kaka'ako. And of course, leprosy was also a big contributor to the massive burial sites in Kaka'ako. So here's an overview of Kawaiahao Church in Kaka'ako. And if you look at the center of that screen, there's a sandy colored area. In that sandy colored area, we unearthed 900 plus Iwi Kupuna from that one little spot right there. And in that spot, the Iwi Kupuna was about 1 to 2 feet under the surface. So it's not like we had to dig very deep. They were literally right at the surface. 900 sets. In this map, if you look at that red marker where it says 560 Ala Moana Boulevard, that's the site of where the leprosy hospital was. So if you look to the upper right of this image where Kawaiahao Church is, from the church to where this red dot is just filled with burial sites. In this image, the red dot is right at the Honolulu Fire Department at Kaka'ako. And on their grounds, they have a burial pit that has over 1,000 burial sites that is still sitting there today. And you can see the proximity to Kawaiahao Church, again in the upper right. If you look at this image, you'll see the Honolulu Brewing and Malting Company kind of in the center of this image. The grassy area to the left of it is another burial pit that has, I believe, over 2,000 burial or Iwi Kupuna in there. Still there till this day. When caring for Iwi Kupuna, should we come across them in a project, the number one option is to leave them in place and undisturbed. If we have to do something with the kupuna, the Iwi Kupuna, the idea would be to put them back in place and preserve them where we found them. The third option is to relocate. That's the last option. All of these require a burial treatment plan that must be approved by SHPD, the Burial Council, and the cultural and/or lineal descendants. So in this next slide is a little bit of the background of what happened at Kawaiahao Church and our Iwi Kupuna. So in 2005, the company that I worked for, Cultural Service Hawaii, sent a warning to Kauai Ha'o Church of the high probability of discovering Iwi Kupuna based on some maps that we had in our office. In 2007, they came up with a plan to remodel and rebuild their archive education center. That's after we already warned them that in 2005 we told them you guys are going to come across Iwi. And sure enough, 2 years later, we began unearthing all of these Iwi. Interestingly enough, when I was working there, I knew the count had already exceeded 900 sets of Iwi Kupuna at Kauai Ha'o Church. But the church was only reporting a fraction of that to the press, like 64, 65. So they kept a lot of this secret, and even to this day, they haven't released the actual number of Iwi Kupuna that they really discovered there. Here's an article written by the Honolulu Advertiser covering this story about Kauai Ha'o Church, and if you read the third paragraph, it says that we urged them to do more subsurface testing to check for Iwi and other artifacts, and the church opted to not conduct a study, and they began construction anyway. In this snippet from the Advertiser, my boss David Scheidler had proposed doing 5 test pits, and the 5 test pits can give you a general idea of what you're going to find there. But again, they declined to take our advice or our warning, and they went and began their construction regardless. If you continue reading these next 2 slides, which is also from the same article, you're going to see that the logic that Kauai Ha'o Church used to determine if they were going to build or not was the fact that the warning we gave them, they felt it wasn't accurate because we didn't have any GPS maps. The maps that we had were old maps from 1893, 1898, and they thought that the margin of error would be as much as 30 feet off. So they thought they were safe if they went and began construction on this project. So this concludes my presentation on Iwi Kupuna. I hope you've learned something. I hope you are aware now that there are laws in place on what happens if we inadvertently discover Iwi Kupuna, and what happens when the system fails. So we give them a heads up, we give them a warning based on all the research we've done. You're gonna find Iwi Kupuna, and the dollar is so powerful that they just want to develop and have disregard for what we're trying to tell them, and they go ahead and do it anyway. And then this happens. So some questions for you would be like, what do you think about Iwi Kupuna in general? And what do you think should be done in Kauai Ha'o Church? The Iwi that was unearthed are still sitting there inside their basement. They haven't been reinterred. They haven't been processed. They're sitting just waiting to see what's the next step. So that the 900 sets that are in there were removed from the ground, were taken to a basement at Kauai Ha'o Church, and they've been sitting there for 13 years now, something like that. And I got a chance to go and see them. So one day when I was working at Cultural Service Hawaii, I had heard about the horrendous conditions that the Iwi Kupuna were located inside the church. So I told my boss them that I was going to go on a site visit to the church, and I put on my badge so I could have access. I went to Kauai Ha'o Church, I showed them my badge, I signed in, but instead of going out to the site outside, I went downstairs in the basement to look for the Iwi Kupuna. No one knew I was down there. At the time, they were remodeling. So when I went down there, there was a lot of plastic tarps, and some of the lights weren't working, some of the rooms weren't developed yet. And so I proceeded down this corridor, I turned left, and as I got to the end, there was a shed or a room that looked like a shed that was made out of like chain link fence. And it was clear that this was the maintenance room. This is like the room where you put the lawnmowers and the weed eaters and the rakes and all that kind of stuff. And the reason I know that, because all that stuff was outside of the gate, outside of this fenced in area. Inside that cage had all the Iwi, and they were sitting on a shelf. Some of them were processed in Senate bags and wrapped in linen, and some were not. And for me, I thought that was very disrespectful. To remove the Iwi from the ground and to put them into a storage shed was unacceptable. So I had told my boss them and my friends and my family what I had seen, and till today, the people that I told back then are still fighting for the rights for that Iwi. They want them to be treated better. They want them to be put back in place and reburied and stop the project. The problem that the church has is that in Christianity, because it is a Christian church, in Christianity, the bones turn to dust, to dirt, and the soul leaves to heaven or whatever their next location is going to be. So the value of Iwi Kupuna in Christianity is zero. The value of Iwi Kupuna in Hawaiian culture is very high. So it's a clash of cultures. The church has the upper hand. They've been doing this now for 13 years. Our Iwi Kupuna are still sitting there. Hopefully, there's something that you guys can do as a class. Maybe you guys could write a letter, make a protest, or do something to remedy that situation so our Iwi Kupuna is not sitting in no basement. So that's my presentation today. I hope you guys learned something. I hope there's something you guys can do to act on to improve that situation. And thank you very much for listening. My name is Kavika Cruz, and I hope I get to meet you in person. Last semester when I did this presentation, it was in class, so it lasted a whole hour. And I couldn't get this video to last an hour because there's really no feedback from anybody. But all the information that I would share in the class has been shared here with you. So I hope this opens up your eyes to see how this process works, not just for Iwi Kupuna, but for cultural impact assessments. On the west side, we have that PNG, I think it's called, the landfill expansion that people have been protesting, got the 30-meter telescope that people have been protesting. All of those projects started off with a cultural impact assessment for an environmental impact statement. So what you could do, the next time you find out about a project that's starting, see if you can participate in that cultural impact assessment and give your thoughts on it up front. If you agree with it or disagree, and maybe your voice could make a difference. So again, have a great day. Hope you have a great semester. Stay safe. Look forward to meeting you in person when this pandemic is over. Aloha and a hui hou.